Okay, so I want to throw in my 2 cents in this topic. It's a sort of continuation to Ancient Runes video about why low drop rates are bad. And to be clear, I mostly agree with his point of view. But there's some specific nuance around my enjoyment of these games and loot in video games in general. The Borderlands 4 deep dive sparked my interest in Borderlands again, and I keep thinking about this topic, so this is meant to be a summary of my opinions on loot, so I don't have to repeat them again. I do genuinely enjoy the loot experience, and sometimes the chase for rare items, but it is not the sole reason why I play and enjoy games that focus on loot. I'm particularly driven by wanting to see all the cool items the game has to offer and make cool builds around them, though nowhere near to the degree of theory crafting of rune, quag, lazy data, etc. I'm generally more casual, but I still agree with the idea that the biggest strength of loot is just the sheer number of options you're given, which is partially ironic, considering that the randomization of those options, in a way, deters you from experimenting more easily. The act of needing to go out and get these items does make the game more fun and satisfying for me, and it can feel a little empty if it's not present. So I hate using save editors, as they pretty quickly kill my enjoyment of the game. But at the same time, the main driving force is still coming up with a build idea at the start, and then seeing the build work at the end. The farming part in the middle just kind of glues the experience together, adds more substance to it with the way I happen to enjoy the game. Because it's not the only point of enjoyment, if that part drags out and takes too long, or the method in which you farm something is uninteresting or tedious, it diminishes my excitement for the other two parts. So it's a very, very fine balance for me. So while I'm not at the point where I don't care about farming whatsoever, as I'm sure some of these people would absolutely prefer if you could just choose your items, I also prefer much higher drop rates or some other means of getting the thing you want, as Rune puts it, over some concept of perceived rarity and value that an item might have. These items aren't trophies for me, first and foremost, but keys to more gameplay. So I don't want particularly build enabling items to be trophies, whether that is because the base item itself has a low drop rate or there's a lot of different variants of that item and only some of those variants are useful for a specific build. And that is completely ignoring the concept of a perfect roll, which has never been necessary, though still matters for those that do want to theory craft and optimize. Low legendary drop rates only work if the item that drops on the ground actually has a high chance of being something you want. Both because of it being a specific base item you want, whether you know it or not beforehand, for instance if you come across a completely new item you haven't seen before, as well as a version of that item that is useful to you. That second point can be alleviated by giving the player options for modifying the item after they've dropped, as seen in other major loot-based action RPGs like Path of Exile or Last Epoch, games which people love to compare to when saying that the genre is only about getting loot. Not to mention my personal favorite loot system in Godfall, where a large part of player power comes from very player-friendly item upgrading and modification, without diminishing the importance of the dropped item itself. Borderlands is a massive outlier in not having anything of the sort. We had Anointment re-rolling BL3 and that's it. I don't even think it should be re-rolling necessarily, but rather something you are more sure of, but you can only do a limited number of times. Like choosing one random passive on a legendary class mod or artifact in BL3 and swapping it out for another. Only one passive per item, but you know what the outcome is. That would be much, much more fun than re-rolling, but re-rolling would be better than nothing. BL3 practically needs its insanely high drop rates for you to get anything specific you'd be looking for in a reasonable time frame, because Borderlands as a series is so averse to giving any amount of control over your drops. At least control that isn't dedicated farming, which I also don't really like, unless it's relegated solely to the most interesting, engaging, mechanically intensive fights. There should absolutely be some form, or maybe even multiple forms, of target farming, but dedicated farming as introduced and normalized by BL2 kinda sucks. The fact that the last two games haven't had them on launch is kinda indicative that not even Gearbox really wants them in the game in that form. It would be hilarious to me if this happens again, as it would further prove my point, since then it's definitely not a mistake. I'm still fine with dedicated drops existing, however uninteresting they are to me most of the time, as a lot of people do want them and will complain about their absence if they're not in, to which Gearbox will inevitably listen. But it should never be the only good way to farm for something specific, and not even the best way, just a way, hopefully amongst many different options that cater to different people. For me, I want endgame activities to be a genuinely good source of loot, both specific and general, and not just be the final challenge you do with that loot that you got from elsewhere. The last time we had this in Borderlands was Chromarax in BL1, or if not endgame activities, then in general much more memorable bosses with more in-depth mechanics that don't die in 3 seconds or less. I throw around this number pretty regularly, that you should be able to get to 80 to 85%-ish build efficiency fairly easily, where you have all the correct items, pretty good versions of all those items, and everything works mechanically how you want. But then the rest, getting up to that 100%, is just optimizing the numbers to the fullest. The infinite loot grind to get the slightly better version. In BL3, with the sheer number of variables and the strength of those variables, and the fact that you have little to no control over them, this is pretty hard to achieve, despite what the 300 legendary items on the ground tells you. Now, those legendary items, and the way they are balanced, are absolutely harmful to the game when you are in the story. And nobody can argue that BL3's story experience isn't totally trivialized by it. Since most things are balanced for the endgame, and works just fine when you are in said endgame, but the vast difference between story difficulty and endgame difficulty breaks them for the story, which is a shame, but a completely separate issue. In my opinion, you should see a sizable number of legendaries even in the story, especially if the game has a lot of different items, like BL3 does, since legendaries are generally the coolest pieces of gear in the game, and I want to use those items and have everyone else playing the game see what the game can do with its item system, to not hide those items until the end game. But obviously, it's a problem when 90% of those items one-shot every basic enemy. I guess my point is, I just don't want to spend 50 hours, not even 20 hours, farming one item, just to see if my idea works, or even to get to that 80%-ish perfect efficiency, whatever that might mean for an item, a build, etc. I want to spend 200 hours with the game, experiencing all it has to offer, every item and build I would be interested in playing with, and then leave the game, satisfied. Further playtime past that point should be brought about because the game is just fundamentally fun to play. The gunplay is fun, the action skills and builds are fun, the dedicated endgame activities like takedowns are interesting and replayable, If those things can keep me engaged for longer, even better. But the loot chase alone will not, and will actually harm it if it takes too large of a spotlight. I don't really have anything else to say. That pretty much sums it up. So, I hate Borderlands.